Killing Floor 2 ends with civilization in ruins, communications down, governments collapsed, military forces systematically wiped out across Europe. A continent that was the center of human culture for thousands of years, reduced to a battlefield between desperate survivors and the bioengineered monsters. Horzine accidentally let loose. That's where Killing Floor 2 leaves things, and then Killing Floor 3 starts in 291. 70 years later, with Horzine still operating, still producing Zeds, still powerful enough that no government on Earth has managed to shut it down, and a brand new research division running experiments that could make everything that came before look minor by comparison. 70 years passed between those two moments. And the franchise never fully explained what happened in them. So today, that's exactly where we're going to piece together what the world looked like when Killing Floor 2 ended, what had to happen in those 70 years for the world of Killing Floor 3 to exist, and what the gaps in the official story might actually be hiding. If you have never played either game, don't worry, you don't need any prior knowledge to follow this. The story works completely on its own. Let's start at the end of Killing Floor 2 and work forward. When Killing Floor 2 takes place, the world is already in serious trouble. 1 month after the original London outbreak, the Zed infection has spread across continental Europe at a pace nobody was prepared to stop. The European Union is essentially paralyzed. Governments have collapsed under the weight of an enemy they never had any framework to fight. Military forces that tried to respond got wiped out because conventional military tactics weren't designed for bioengineered creatures that don't respond to fear or exhaustion or supply lines the way human armies do. Survivors are hiding. Small groups of mercenaries are doing what they can, moving through Zed-infested zones and clearing what they find, funded privately because the governments that would normally handle something like this no longer functionally exist. Hans Volter, the century-old Nazi scientist kept alive through Horzine's own technology, is actively militarizing specimens in France, upgrading the patriarch into something even more dangerous than what first escaped London. And Kevin Klimley himself, transformed into the patriarch, is still out there, with his cloning operations still running and his facilities still producing Zeds in numbers that nobody is managing to keep up with. That is where Killing Floor 2 leaves civilization on the edge, barely holding on, with the infection spreading, and the people best positioned to stop it fighting each other almost as much as they're fighting the Zeds. And somehow, 70 years later, the lights are back on. Killing Floor 3's world is not the collapse. Killing Floor 2 was heading toward it's a different kind of broken, not a world where governments have fallen and communications have failed, and survivors are hiding in burned out buildings. It's a world that recovered, not fully, not cleanly. Not in a way that looks anything like the world that existed before the outbreak, but the lights are on, there are cities, there are corporations. There is enough functioning society for Horzine to have grown into a mega corporation so embedded in global systems that no government can remove it. That gap between the collapsing world of KF2 and the functioning but deeply wrong world of KF3 is the 70 years nobody has fully explained, so let's think through what had to happen to get from one to the other. First, the Zed spread had to be contained at some point. Not eliminated, not cured, contained. The infected zones in KF3 still exist. Zeds are still everywhere. But civilization as a functioning entity exists again, which means at some point in those 70 years, something stopped the outright collapse and created enough stability for societies to rebuild around the new reality. The most likely answer is that the mercenary model Horzine introduced, paying survivors to fight Zeds rather than deploying conventional military against them, actually worked well enough to establish some kind of controlled containment. Not a cure, just management, a permanent state of armed coexistence with the Zed threat where humanity holds enough ground to function, not a victory. A ceasefire that never officially ended. Second, Horzine had to actively rebuild its public image. Think about where Horzine stands at the end of KF2, the company that caused the outbreak, the company that secretly created bioweapons under government contract, the company whose CEO transformed himself into one of his own monsters rather than face accountability. By 2091, that same company is a functioning megacorporation with enough influence to operate globally, maintain research divisions, run advanced experiments, and resist government intervention. That doesn't happen accidentally. That requires a deliberate, sustained, multi-decade effort to reframe what Horzine is and what it does. The mercenary program was part of that, presenting the company as the solution rather than the cause, paying people to fight the Zeds while quietly maintaining control over the research that kept the Zeds existing in the first place. Governments that had collapsed and were trying to rebuild needed answers. Horzine provided a framework that desperate societies were willing to accept because the alternative was nothing. Horzine sold survival back to the people it had nearly destroyed, and enough of those people bought it that the company emerged from the worst catastrophe in modern history more powerful than it was before. Third, someone had to deal with Kevin Clemedy, or at least with the Patriarch clones. At the end of KF2, the revelation that the Patriarch was mass-produced, that there was never just one. Kevin Clemedy turned monster, but potentially hundreds of copies of him, is the kind of detail that has enormous implications for the 70-year gap. If Horzine was producing Patriarch clones and the company survived and rebuilt over those 70 years, what happened to those clones? Were they contained, destroyed, repurposed into something else entirely? The game doesn't tell us, but the fact that KF3 has entirely new bosses, the Queen Crawler, the Impaler, the Chimera, rather than returning Patriarch encounters, suggests that whatever happened to the Patriarch line, it's no longer the dominant threat it was during KF2's timeline. Either it was contained enough to become a managed threat, or the new research Moorcroft is running with the Mire simply superseded it. The old line became less relevant as a new and more dangerous generation of bioweapons was developed. And that transition from one generation of horror to the next is probably the most honest summary of those 70 years. Horzine didn't stop, it just upgraded. Fourth, and this one is worth slowing down for. Cordelia Clamley had to grow up. She was born into a world still recovering from what her grandfather caused. She served in the military, which means there was a military functioning well enough to have a Grenadier Guards unit she could join. She spent decades in the anti-bioweapons movement before founding Nightfall in 2089, working through every legitimate channel available to her, trying to address the Horzine problem through official systems. Those channels existed, she used all of them, and not one of them worked. The fact that anti-bioweapons movements existed as a political and social force by the time Cordelia was active tells you something important about the world. Those 70 years produced, it was a world with advocacy organizations and political movements and legal frameworks. A world recognizable as a functioning civil society, even if that society had quietly normalized living alongside bioengineered monsters. And it was a world where all of those systems, all of those legitimate channels, all of those decades of work by people who knew what Horzine actually was, still couldn't stop the company from doing whatever it wanted. That's what eventually pushed Cordelia past the point of working within the system. And the Nightfall specialists themselves are actually the clearest window into what those 70 years felt like from the inside. They were born between 2039 and 2068. The oldest of them arrived roughly 19 years after the KF2 outbreak. The youngest was born nearly 50 years after it. These are people who grew up in the recovered world, not the collapsing one, not the burning one. The one that rebuilt around a permanent Zed threat and a mega corporation that everyone quietly understood had caused the crisis and that nobody had managed to hold accountable. They didn't experience the outbreak as a catastrophe they survived. They experienced it as history, as the thing that shaped the world they were born into and that the adults around them had spent their entire lives trying to navigate around, and every single one of them still ended up in Nightfall, which tells you something real about those 70 years. The world rebuilt, the lights came back on, civilization started functioning again, but nobody who knew what actually happened, rather than what Horzine spent decades telling everyone happened, ever really accepted the version of events the company was selling. The survivors of the outbreak eventually died. Their children grew up, and some of those children decided they were done working through the channels that clearly hadn't worked. Nightfall is what 70 years of frustration looks like when it finally runs out of patience. So what actually happened in those 70 years? The honest answer is that the franchise left most of it deliberately unwritten. The codex entries in KF3 stop at 2091. The game focuses on now rather than on the gap. The story it's telling is about what exists, not about how the world got from the burning aftermath of KF2 to the corporate dystopia of KF3. But the world of KF3 implies an answer even without stating when humanity survived. Not because the Zed threat was defeated, because Horzine made itself the manager of a crisis it created, because governments desperate to rebuild accepted a framework that kept the threat controlled enough to function around. Because 70 years of managed coexistence with bioengineered monsters was enough time for an entire generation to grow up that had never known anything different. And because in all that time, with all that recovery, and all those legitimate channels, nobody managed to actually fix the problem, until Cordelia sold her inheritance and started building something that wasn't interested in fixing the problem the polite way anymore. That's the 70 years, the gap that nobody fully explained. and what the world of Killing Floor 3 tells us it must have looked like. If you want to go deeper on Horzine's history, Nightfall's team, or what Moorcroft's research means for this world going forward, all of those videos are in the playlist below. You don't need to have played any of the games to follow any of it. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and drop a comment. What do you think actually happened in those 70 years that the franchise skipped? Because I have a feeling the story is going to start filling in some of those gaps as the seasons keep coming. Tell me what you think.